I'd just like to start off by welcoming everybody today. My name is Chris Kilford, and I'm the president of the Canadian International Council Victoria branch. And I'd like to welcome our guests, our Union Club members here today, our CIC members and new CIC members, and of course our guest speaker as well. I'd also like to acknowledge that our CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen people, today known as the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations. I'd also like to thank my team, Paul and Jennifer, who are on the desk today, and Roger, who's not here, working in the background, collecting your money, that sort of thing. I couldn't do it without their help, so thanks, guys, for that. Now, before we get fully underway today, our event is being recorded as part of CIC's Canada Speaks event series, and it will be available to the general public and to you, of course, via our CIC National YouTube channel. And I would like to acknowledge and thank Power Corporation of Canada for their sponsorship of the Canada Speaks event series. And this is the third event in the series, with 3 more to come in 2023. So let's get started. Now, as we know, and for the most part, the midterms dust in the United States has finally settled, and we've now had time to take stock of what did happen, and obviously with a keen eye to 2024. Now, certainly here in Canada, and as Becca knows, we keep a very keen eye on what happens in the United States and what it might signify for us in the future. So I was very delighted when Becca accepted our invitation to come north of the border to help us understand what could be the most pressing challenges for democracy in the United States in the years ahead, and if some of the recent retrenchments that we have seen are symptomatic of the democratic backsliding in America. Now, Dr. Thorpe, Rebecca Thorpe, Becca, is a political science professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, where she is currently teaching a variety of courses, including American national institutions. Her work has received national recognition, including the American Political Science Association's Richard Neustadt Award for Best Book on Executive Politics in 2015, and the D.B. Hardiman Award presented by the Lyndon B. Johnson Foundation for the Best Book about the U.S. Congress in 2016. Now, her recent articles and panels have included, for example, U.S. Empire in the Age of Trump and the Biden Agenda, Promises and Prospects, respectively. Becca, welcome to Canada. Welcome to CIC Victoria, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that really generous introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here with you this afternoon and to talk to you about the 2022 midterms in perspective. The topic of my talk is American democracy in crisis? I want to start by looking at midterm losses in historical perspective. So as you can see in these figures here, the president's party nearly always loses seats in the midterms. So the Democrats lost a whopping 63 seats in 2010 and another 13 seats in 2014. Republicans lost 40 seats in 2018. Now, it's a little bit more variable in the Senate, but on average, since 1934, the president's party has lost 28 seats in the House and 4 seats in the Senate. Yet this year's midterms largely defied these trends and more or less reaffirmed the status quo. So we all know, and we can see here, that Democrats retained a majority in the Senate. Republicans did take back the House, but Democrats only lost a net of about a half dozen seats. And Democrats actually made some small gains in gubernatorial races. So Democrats flipped 3 races for governor seats. Republicans flipped 1. The vast majority stayed exactly the same. So all told, this is the best performance by an incumbent party since 2002, and it's the best Democratic performance since 1998. Now, I think there are 2 main takeaways from these outcomes. And the first one is that the Republicans vastly underperformed relative to the expectations. Now, given Biden's low approval rating and a poor economy, this race was seen as a harbinger for a Republican blowout, yet we can see that that clearly did not happen, right? Democrats largely held their ground. Now, second, and I think maybe even more importantly, the nightmare scenario here was election rigging conspiracies, intimidation, violence, and for the most part, these things did not happen. It looks like there was pretty high turnout on both sides, which suggests that both sides think that their vote matters. There was some ticket splitting. Some of the more high-profile election-denying candidates lost their races. These are all really good signs for American democracy. Now, the questions that's on everybody's mind: what does this mean for 2024? What does this mean moving forward? Will Biden run, or is he too old or too tired or too uninspiring? Is Trump's candidacy really viable? Who's likely to win? Well, this type of forecasting is really the pop side of politics. It's valuable, but it's a form of political hobbyism. It keeps us on our toes, it keeps us sweating, keeps us rooting for our team. But to really understand American politics, we need to look beyond the horse race, and we really need to think about political institutions. So that's what I'm going to do for the remainder of this talk, although I'm happy to return to these questions during the Q&A. So with this focus on institutions, I'm going to suggest that American democracy is facing a crisis, and the crisis is twofold. So first, the power to set public policy is increasingly disconnected from public opinion. And second, and related, the rules of democracy are under threat. And by rules, I don't just mean which team will win. I mean rules regarding equity, fairness, rule of law, fidelity to facts, peaceful transfer of power. And I'm going to suggest that these problems are actually self-reinforcing. So to do this, I'm going to shift our focus from the horse race to the system, the broader institutional structure. And I'm going to focus specifically on how US institutions produce counter-majoritarian outcomes. So that is outcomes where the popular winner is not the same as the electoral winner. And I'm going to show how this manifests in the Senate, the presidency, and the House, and how it's currently reflected in the US Supreme Court composition. And just to be clear, I'll use the terms counter-majoritarian and anti-democratic more or less interchangeably. So the upshot here is that the counter-majoritarian structure of US institutions has created a context where the current Republican Party has engineered a path to power that is fundamentally at odds with majoritarian democracy. Now, some of you might say, wait a minute, Becca, these were really close elections. There was pretty high turnout, there were no landslides, no violence, no rampant election denialism. It looks like US democracy is actually in pretty good shape, pretty healthy, robust, maybe even self-correcting. And I think that there is some truth to this. So when I say that the system is counter-majoritarian, I don't mean that only one party can reasonably compete for power. I mean that the constitutional structure prevents national majorities from governing effectively. So from doing things like passing laws that a majority of the population supports. Instead, our institutions amplify the power of an entrenched political minority, and this in turn makes the system more vulnerable to anti-democratic appeals. So you have sort of this vicious cycle. Now, the US has always had counter-majoritarian institutions. That's not new. But for most of US history, majoritarian standards did prevail. Now, historically, the US has had a highly circumscribed franchise. So the system was clearly undemocratic on the basis of equality and voting rights. But fully enfranchised majorities did generally get their way. And this is because both political parties benefited and suffered from the Constitution's anti-democratic features. So while counter-majoritarian features are not new, they've had a distinctly partisan effect in the 21st century. That's new. So for example, Democrats won the popular vote in 7 of the past 8 presidential elections, yet 2 of the past 4 presidents took office despite losing the popular vote. At the same time, we have a Supreme Court that's dominated by Republican appointees, that was affirmed by a Senate majority that is not reflective of the national majority. And senators representing a majority of Americans are increasingly unable to pass legislation. And finally, even the more majoritarian House is increasingly uncompetitive as a result of social sorting and gerrymandering. So given these outcomes, political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in a award-winning and best-selling book, How Democracies Die, who concluded that the US is far and away the most counter-majoritarian democracy in the world. All right, so how did we get here? Well, these outcomes are rooted in the constitutional structure, but this was not a result of deliberate design. It was instead a result of accident and contingency. So if you take, for example, the US Senate, so comparative scholars have commented that the US Senate is the most malapportioned institution across all Western democracies. And this is because of the system of equal representation, where every state gets 2 senators regardless of their population. So this means that a voter in Wyoming with a population of about 550,000 people has about 60 times more power to influence the Senate's direction than a voter in California with a population of about 40 million people. Now, the Senate has always been malapportioned, giving less populous states outsized political power relative to their population, but this did not have partisan implications until the 21st century. And this is because historically there were no issue cleavages that systematically divided residents of large states with more people from residents of smaller states with fewer people. Historically, there was a really pronounced north-south cleavage. There's always been regional divisions, but there was no systematic rural and urban cleavage until in recent decades, parties have increasingly sorted along ideological and geographic lines. So Bill Bishop refers to this as the big sort, where liberals have increasingly concentrated in metropolitan areas in more populous states, while conservatives tend to reside in smaller cities, exurbs, more rural enclaves. Alan Abramowitz refers to the Great Alignment, where people's race, religion, and ideology increasingly correspond and align with their partisanship. Well, political scientist Liliana Mason argues that this sort of social sorting increases tribalism and animosity against outgroups. And that's true even regardless of any substantive issue disagreement. So increasingly, we have a white, religious, conservative, non-metropolitan base that's pitted against an increasingly multiracial, secular, highly educated, democratic base. And a result of this social sorting and this animosity, we increasingly see that people don't want their children marrying someone in the opposing party. People increasingly view the opposing party as alien, dangerous, even an existential threat to the nation. And our institutions actually reinforce rather than mitigate these divisions. And this is because institutions amplify the political power of a minority of white rural voters, some of whom are opposed to multiracial democracy and beholden to the lie that Trump won the 2020 election. So you can see in this figure that I got from the New York Times, one white voter in Wyoming has the same power in the Senate as 59 multiracial voters in California. So how does this affect partisan disadvantage? Well, the statistician Nate Silver, which some of you might know from the website 538, has compared the share of Republican senators in the 15 most populous states and the 25 least populous states from 1920 to 2020. And he found that Republicans represented both large and small states about equally until about 1960. These patterns converged again in the 1970s, which was a period of relative bipartisanship, and then they polarized in the 21st century. At the same time, he found that from 2015 to 2020, Republicans controlled a majority in the Senate while representing, a minority of the population. And demographic trends are actually exacerbating this problem. So in 2010, about 50% of Americans lived in 9 states, which are shaded in navy here on this map to your left. And among them, they controlled 18 senators, while the 25 smallest states, which are shaded in light blue, had 18% of the population, yet controlled among them a Senate majority. Now, this graphic illustrates the same imbalance in a different way. So you can see that these 62 senators represent the same number of people as these 6 senators. Now, forecasts suggest that by 2040, 70% of Americans will live in the 15 largest states, and they'll be represented by a total of 30 senators. While the remaining 30% of Americans spread out across 35 states will control 70 senators. Now, this is a crisis for democracy and a recipe for entrenched minority rule. And the legal scholar Lawrence Tribe was reflecting on Senate malapportionment when he commented that the rise of minority rule in America is now unmistakable. And this plays out in national elections as well. So this is a figure of showing the Senate midterm results in 2018. Now, in 2018, Democratic candidates for Senate received 59% of the vote share. The type font is really tiny, but it does say this on the map, compared to 39% for Republicans. Yet Republicans actually increased their Senate majority in this year, gaining 3 seats and retaining the majority. Now, data on the vote share for the 2022 outcomes is not available yet, but this New York Times graphic shows the Senate results by size of the lead, and this is broken down by counties. So you can see in this figure that Democrats are winning by really large margins in urban areas in large states, while Republicans are winning by much smaller margins in more sparsely populated areas. So what this means is that Republicans can win a majority in the Senate without appealing to the so-called median voter. And it means that the Senate as an institution is increasingly accountable to a shrinking base of disproportionately white, rural, evangelical voters. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Democrats can't ever win a majority in the Senate. We saw that they just did, although they did so very narrowly. But what it does mean is that Democrats have to win by fairly large margins in order to effectively capture and retain a Senate majority. So far more than the 50% threshold that we imagine when we think about majoritarian democracy. Now, I'd like to turn our attention to the US House. Now, the House of Representatives was the only national institution that was originally designed as a majoritarian institution that would be directly elected by the people. And so it's designed to be proportional where representation is proportional to the population. But because of the electoral structure, which are single-member districts with winner-take-all voting rules, there are actually 2 factors that can create counter-majoritarian outcomes. So the first one is gerrymandering. So state legislatures are often empowered to draw district boundaries, and they're increasingly drawing them in partisan ways. So this is a map of the results in 2018 in North Carolina. And in North Carolina, 48% of the voters supported Democratic candidates, yet Democrats won only 3 out of the 13 House seats. Now, Republicans currently control a majority of state houses, and while both parties are, both parties do use gerrymandering, Republicans are gerrymandering far more aggressively than Democrats are. Now, at the same time, single-member districts where disadvantage a party where members are geographically concentrated regardless of gerrymandering. So even if you imagine in the abstract the most neutral redistricting plan possible, partisan geography would give Republicans an automatic advantage. And this is because, as we saw before, Democrats are tightly packed into large metropolitan areas, and they're winning a lot of House seats in urban areas by landslides. And because of the system of winner-take-all elections, anything beyond a plurality or a majority is considered to be a wasted vote. So by wasted, I mean that the vote doesn't support the candidate that the person voted for, and it doesn't do anything to help their political party. And we can see this play out at the national level as well. So as a result of this, in the House elections in 2012, Democrats won 1 million more votes than Republicans did, yet Democrats lost the majority, 201 to the Republicans 233. And again, there's no final data on the popular vote share in 2022, but it's worth noting that in this recent election cycle, Democrats did win an unlikely share of really close races. So that's likely to actually narrow the gap between seats and vote share. Now, I'm going to hone in on examples in a couple of states, but I also want to emphasize that these consequences are actually more extreme at the state level. Now, to our peril, the political scientists and journalists largely ignored state elections for many decades. I think this was just the result of the nationalization of politics. Everyone's attention was on, what's happening in the House and in the Senate. But recently, there's been some pretty outstanding reporting by journalists like Ari Bateman at Mother Jones, Jane Mayer at The New Yorker, by The New York Times. One of my colleagues at the University of Washington, Jake Grumbach, just wrote a book called Laboratories Against Democracy, where he finds that in states where Republicans control the state government, they're using that power to systematically limit democratic access. These are figures from a report by a leading team of political scientists, and they're showing that Republicans are winning a large majority, in some cases a super majority of seats, without winning a majority of the vote share in states like Virginia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and North Carolina. So for example, in 2018 in Wisconsin, Republicans won 64% of the seats for the state assembly with only 44% of the vote. And they used this power to do things like pass laws restricting ballot access. They eliminated any restrictions on campaign finance, and they ran candidates that challenged the 2020 presidential election for governor, attorney general, and secretary of state. And Ari Berman, in this article, argued forcefully that Republicans in Wisconsin are essentially laying the groundwork to seize power to oversee elections from a bipartisan commission invested in a partisan state legislature. And these trends influence the 2022 races as well. So on a whole, Democrats actually made some pretty significant gains in the states in this last election cycle. So they broke unified Republican control in Arizona and Pennsylvania, and Democrats actually won unified control in Massachusetts, Maryland, Michigan, and Minnesota. Now compare that with Wisconsin. Now in Wisconsin, Republicans lost the governor's race and the attorney general's race. Last I checked, Secretary of State was still too close to call. They won the Senate race very narrowly. So this suggests that there is a pretty equal partisan balance on the state level, right? That there's competition and really thin margins between Republicans and Democrats. Yet Republicans won 75% of the House seats, and they won 64% of the seats in the Wisconsin State Assembly. And these trends are even more pronounced in Ohio. In Ohio, Republicans won 66% of the US House seats, 68% of the seats in the state assembly, and 78% of the seats in the state Senate. And researchers have argued that these district maps are drawn so that the Republican Party effectively cannot lose, where the only races that Republican incumbents are worried about are the primaries, which tend to be dominated by partisans, activists. So the threat for these incumbents is being outflanked by a more far-right rival. And this is particularly consequential given the share of Republican state senators, or legislators, that are promoting election lies and that are still seeking to overturn the 2020 election results. And I'm going to circle back to this point at the very end of the talk. So I'd like to turn now to presidential contests. So presidential elections are governed by the Electoral College. So each state manages their own elections, and 48 of the 50 states use winner-take-all voting rules. Now, for most of US history, the Electoral College produced outcomes that aligned with the national majority vote. There are a few exceptions, but these were mostly the result of confounding factors. So for instance, in 1824, state legislators in some states still directly handpicked the electors. In 1876 and 1888, the elections were notoriously plagued by fraud and violence. But 2000 and 2016 are more straightforward examples of counter-majoritarian outcomes. Now, like the Senate, the Electoral College does inflate the vote share in smaller, less populous states. But this is not what's driving anti-majoritarian outcomes in the Electoral College. Rather, it's voters in large swing states that have the most outsized impact. So you can see in this figure from 1988, the majority of states were historically competitive in presidential elections. So you have really close vote margins in 1988, maybe with the exception of Utah, which was more of a Republican landslide. Now, compare this with 2016, and you see that the results are much more polarized, right? So in 2016, most states are deciding the election just by huge margins. So they're resulting in landslides. And only 4 states were even considered to be competitive, meaning that the vote margin was less than 5%. So it's uneven partisan geography that's really driving these anti-democratic outcomes. And this is because Democrats tend to win large states by large margins, as we see here, and then lose large states by much smaller margins. So for instance, Clinton won 3 of the 10 largest states by pretty huge margins, 30% in California, 22% in New York, 17% in Illinois. Trump won 7 of the 10 largest states, but he won them by smaller margins. So less than 1.3% in Michigan, Florida, and Pennsylvania, just for example. So this means that Clinton won 36 million votes in the 10 largest states compared to 31 million for Trump. But Trump won them more efficiently, and he captured more Electoral College votes. So this is how Clinton managed to win the national popular vote by about 3 million votes, yet still lose in the Electoral College, because she lost by very small margins in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And the point to emphasize here is this wasn't an aberration or an idiosyncrasy. This is likely to happen again, given the nature of partisan geography and the importance of a small handful of swing states. So places like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And the last point that I want to make is to reflect on how this affects the Supreme Court composition. Now, the Supreme Court composition is currently the product of counter-majoritarian outcomes, as we saw with the structural imbalances in both the Senate and in the presidency. So political scientists Lisa Miller and Richard Johnson found that 2 of the current sitting Supreme Court justices would not have been selected or affirmed by the Senate if the Senate was reapportioned on the basis of population. So that includes both Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh. So this is another graphic from the New York Times, and 5 Supreme Court justices would not have been appointed if the president was selected on the basis of the national popular vote as opposed to the Electoral College. So that's Alito and Roberts that were appointed by George W. Bush, and Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett that were all appointed by Trump. There's a legal scholar, Pamela Karlan, who's argued pretty forcefully that these justices on a polarized court are effectively appointing or reaffirming their party's constitutional values. So they're essentially helping the party entrench itself politically. And I think that one of the most paradigmatic examples of this is a court case called Arizona State Legislature versus Arizona Redistricting Commission that was decided in 2015. So the Supreme Court in this case voted 5-4 to allow Arizona to adopt an independent redistricting commission over the opposition of the state legislature. But 4 of the conservative justices dissented, and 2 of the liberal members that were in the majority, Ginsburg and Kennedy, have subsequently been replaced by Kavanaugh and Barrett. Now, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case this term that effectively relitigates this same issue. And the new Supreme Court has signaled that they may adopt an extreme interpretation of the state legislature's prerogative to oversee congressional elections. And Republican lawmakers are arguing that the Elections Clause in the Constitution gives state legislatures the power to determine how congressional elections are conducted without any checks and balances from the state's constitution or from the state courts. So this independent state legislature theory would give state legislatures pretty vast discretion to do things like suppress votes, gerrymander districts, even overturn popular elections. Now, in the most extreme scenario, the state legislature could invoke this theory to refuse to certify election results in presidential elections and instead select their own slate of electors. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk that I believe all of the gubernatorial nominees who sowed doubt about the election results lost their races. So this does alleviate a lot of really immediate and pressing concerns for anyone that's alarmed by these trends or concerned about the fate of American democracy. But I also want to caution that this doesn't mean that US democracy is completely safe and secure. There's been some outstanding reporting by the New York Times, and they showed that more than 370 Republican candidates running for House, Senate, and state offices sowed doubts about the 2020 election results. And of those 370, more than half of them won their races. And some of these are incumbents, but some of them were also newcomers. So by their tabulations, this suggests that more than 170 election skeptics won in the House, more than a dozen won in the Senate, and more than 24 won in state offices. Now, of course, electing lawmakers who spread conspiracy theories about election results both strengthens autocratic leaders abroad, and it also weakens foundations for democracy domestically. Now, while many of the most extreme election deniers, particularly in high-profile races for, governor or other statewide races, lost their contests, many others also won, particularly those that are entrenched in safe seats. So I think it really remains to be seen whether this extreme wing of the Republican Party is viewed as a liability to the Republican Party's ability to win national elections, or if they actually become more emboldened, if they essentially double down and seek to retain their power without having to appeal to national majorities and without having to even abide by election results. Now, I know that there's a lot more to say about what to expect moving forward, what to make of these trends, what should we expect in the next 2 years and beyond, and what can be done. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Becca. Alan is going to come around with the microphone.
Hi, I'm Shirley. I'm just wondering what are the possibilities that the current president can increase the seats on the Supreme Court? I know there was chat about that before. Has he lost the ability to do that?
Yeah, so the question was about whether Biden can increase the size of the Supreme Court. So it would have to go through Congress. So I think at this point, he's lost the ability to do that. If there was ever a chance of doing that, it would have been when he had Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. Although even then, it would need to overcome a filibuster in the Senate. So he would have had to convince 10 Republicans in the Senate to sign on to that plan. So I think it was largely a non-starter from the beginning. So I guess it remains to be seen in future elections, but not likely in the next 2 years.
What might be the implications of looking at demographics in the context of the Great Sort? Are young people in Colorado or Kansas likely to depart from the voting pattern of their parents?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the last 2 election cycles have suggested that younger voters are turning out in larger numbers than they have historically. Now, of course, the caveat there is that younger voters are still not turning out in as high a numbers as older demographics are, but they are voting in very large margins for the Democratic Party. So younger voters were really key, and high turnout among them, or higher relative to previous levels, were key to Democratic victories in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Colorado, even in places like Arizona. So I guess the caveat is that younger demographics have historically tended to identify more as more liberal and tend to be more likely to support Democrats. And those things in the past have tended to shift as younger voters have, aged into older brackets, and then their votes, they've tended to support Republican and more conservative members. So I think a lot of it just remains to be seen whether the factors that younger voters, the things that they're concerned about now. So a lot of them concerned with abortion, election integrity, climate change. If these things continue to be salient, and if these things continue to lead them to support Democrats, and whether they keep turning out, and whether they keep turning out not just at the levels that they're turning out in these past elections, but if that was maybe 26, 27%, whether they keep turning out in higher numbers. If they do, then I think that is likely to provide mobilization and a solid base for Democrats in upcoming elections. I don't think it's likely to realign the parties and really do anything to mitigate the sort of social sorting that we saw.
I have a question about Washington State. We have the same split in British Columbia, almost mirrors Washington and Oregon, with east-west voting patterns. But my question is, why is it a given that rural areas will always be conservative? Because the history of Washington State with mining towns, they were where labor laws were contested in the east, and in Canada, the prairie populism, the idea of universal medical care came from rural areas as well. So why are we giving up on rural areas being right wing?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I don't think that it's certainly not foreordained that, that urban populations will support Democrats and rural populations will support Republicans. It's actually a relatively new trend. So in the 1950s, the parties were actually pretty similar in their makeup and their demographics. So the parties represented, black and white residents, men and women, married and unmarried. Even liberals and conservatives were at home in both of the political parties. Both Democrats and Republicans had urban liberal and rural conservative wings. And party identifiers didn't systematically differ on issues like abortion, guns, civil rights, things that are culture war issues that are dividing the parties now. So I think what really drove this sort of social sorting was the Southern realignment. So in the 1960s and 70s, Nixon directly appealed to white Southern conservatives who were previously Democrats and who were opposed to things like civil rights, feminism, and anti-war activism. So this is what catalyzed what we've now seen is this, geographic and ideological sorting. So is that inevitable? Will that always shape the future of American politics? Not necessarily. But I think that the political parties, political elites, party leaders need to do something to appeal to voters in the opposite camp and the other party's political tent in order to catalyze another realignment. Now, Democrats could effectively try to do this by directly appealing to rural and working class voters. I think John Fetterman's campaign, the Democratic senator in Pennsylvania, is a great example of that. So he's someone that that identifies as rural and working class. I think he also got a degree as Harvard, but he played that down on the campaign trail. He's like 6'3", wears a hoodie, heavily tattooed, and he's someone that people in a lot of rural areas could immediately identify with. He knows how to talk to people in these areas very authentically. He knows what their concerns are. He knows how to speak to them. He knows how to address them. And he also spent a lot more time campaigning in those rural areas than other Democrats have historically done. And he was able to win that race. There was another candidate in Washington's 3rd district, which is historically a Republican district. So Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, who in a huge upset beat the Republican challenger in a seat that was an open race. So she identifies as rural. She lives in a rural area. She is the owner of an auto repair factory, and she won by using the same strategies as Fetterman did. Like she shares the identity of someone that's rural and working class, and can directly speak to them and address those issues. So I think that if Democrats fund those sorts of candidates and seek them out and try to win over a lot of rural and working class voters, that could be a way to to start to realign the parties. And if Democrats can appeal to those voters, then that is a possibility to do something to sort of mitigate the social sorting and the trends that I pointed to earlier.
You mentioned that it seems that some pundits and journalists are beginning to turn their attention to state races, and you've given us some graphics about what's happening at the state level. My observation has been that maybe Democrats have neglected the state level for a long time, and the power to do a lot of the things you're talking about rests there. But is anyone doing research on what we call, both I think in BC and certainly in parts of the state, nonpartisan level politics, so municipal politics, school board politics, and are those sort of is work being done to look at how those are or could be the training grounds and the festering grounds for candidates who are coming up in the future? Is that a place we need to start?
The short answer is yes, we definitely do. And traditionally, municipal politics, I mean, the state politics was off the radar. Nobody was really paying attention to what's happening at the municipal level. So slowly now, increasingly, those sorts of questions and those sorts of races are getting national attention. There was recently an article in the New Yorker that came out that at least peripherally addressed some of those issues and efforts in some states to for what were traditionally nonpartisan offices to like for school board, for example, to make them partisan contests, and the really corrosive effects that this would have on, on the elections generally, on partisanship and, and polarization, and even the ability to effectively manage public schools. So I do think that, increasingly academics, journalists are paying attention to those issues and, do realize that this is part of the Republican Party's strategy is to put their people in these offices, which traditionally, it's not only academics and journalists that don't pay attention, it's most of the citizens, right, aren't paying attention to those contests. They, most people don't know, who who the local officials are in their districts. They don't, pay much attention to those races, might vote on them if they're voting for, say like a House member or a senator in a midterm election or in a presidential year, but they tend to fly under the radar. They don't get a lot of attention. And so it's a lot easier for a political movement to bring out their base and effectively, try to monopolize those races in what's likely to be a low turnout contest. So I think that that belatedly now, the Democratic Party and researchers and others are realizing that we do really need to be paying attention to those contests as well.
I'm wondering if as a political scientist, you're aware of or you see structural ways that some of the undemocratic direction can be reversed. I wonder in particular to the things like gerrymandering and the disproportionate representation of some places, whether there's something that can be done about this at a structural level.
So it really depends on which structural imbalance you're referring to. So for gerrymandering, for example, states can actually pass laws that empower an independent redistricting commission to draw district boundaries and take that power away from partisan state legislators. Some states have elected to do this. Other states are, depending on, I guess, the partisan composition and also the competitiveness of the jurisdiction, are doubling down and maybe resisting efforts to do that. So I mean, state by state, I think there are some efforts to do that. There are other things like the Electoral College, the Senate. Those structural imbalances, I think, are far more deeply entrenched. Because they're actually codified in the Constitution, unlike something like gerrymandering, where there's nothing in the Constitution that requires that, let alone even allows it. The Senate, I think, is the hardest one because Article 5 of the Constitution actually says that reforming the Senate, altering it at all, requires unanimous consent among all the states. So how are you going to convince, right? How are you going to convince Wyoming, Alaska, and the Dakotas, all the states that benefit from that structure, in order to revise something that that they're the primary beneficiaries of? So so that's a much larger challenge.
Thank you, an excellent talk. Could you comment on the influence of dictatorships around the world, or offshore money, offshore influence, and offshore influence on our social media, or is that a major influence that's working in the U.S., or is it all we found the enemy and it is us?
Ooh, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a combination of things. I assume you're primarily referring to, countries like Russia and their role in promoting disinformation in elections. So I think that is a concern, but Russia and countries that are sowing the seeds of disinformation and promoting conspiracy theories on social media, they're not really creating problems so much as exploiting existing divisions and really exacerbating existing problems. And most of the intelligence suggests that that Russia did not have nearly as heavy a hand in the 2020 elections as they did in the 2016 elections. But again, that doesn't mean that they won't try to repeat the same strategies that they used in 2016 in order to interfere with other elections. So I agree. I do think that is a really serious concern. Although, personally, I think that the larger concern is, the internal divisions that are already there. Even if you can neutralize other countries that tried to come in and you use disinformation as a weapon to do things like to either support one candidate or to manufacture just general dissent against the system. I think that there would be domestic actors here, citizens, certain different grassroots movements and other actors that would do that work for them, that are actively using the very same playbook. So that's a real problem.
I take it your message is that the structural changes will not probably take place because of the structure of the Constitution, but the gerrymandering can be addressed. And I wonder if you think that the Democrats have finally decided to take control of state houses and do something to take away the great advantages that the art of cartography have on electing people. Just look at the House of Representative elections in New York State probably decided the outcome of Congress. So do you really think that we'll have some success there in having those disadvantages, undemocratic disadvantages, taken down a little bit?
Yeah, so at the state level, I do think that there is a possibility to make those sorts of gains and to implement those sorts of changes and to do things like require independent redistricting commissions. There's also work that grassroots movements and organizations at the state level can do, for example, by filing lawsuits and trying to get their state courts to overturn the heavily gerrymandered maps in their district and require them to redraw the maps in a way that's less imbalanced and that promotes things like or does a better job promoting things like fairness, equity, and democracy. And I think that there's also a role that social movements and grassroots movements can play in, I guess I stand by my earlier comment that there are really enormous structural impediments to directly reforming things like the Electoral College and specifically the Senate. But I think that those are issues that a lot of social movements, grassroots movements should and can take up in combination with the concerns for things like the voter suppression tactics and protecting and promoting the integrity of elections, because these sorts of structural issues are also things that are really detrimental and really damaging to democracy and to even the ability of government to govern effectively and to pass the policies that they ran on and that their supporters want and expect them to pass. I mean, so just to give you an example, in the last 2 years, with Democrats had slim majorities, but majorities in the House and the Senate. And in the House, I mean, Democrats passed a huge array of laws. They passed 2 laws protecting voter integrity that would have done things like not only preventing states from using voter suppression tactics and recodifying and reaffirming the principles in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but also doing things like eliminating dark money in elections, imposing pretty strict regulations on different forms of campaign finance. The Democratic House passed laws that would have imposed gun regulations that a majority of Americans support, so things like background checks. One of the strongest bills strengthening unions in many, many decades, a bill promoting LGBT rights. Those were some of the more high-profile ones, but the House passed hundreds of laws in the last congressional session that just died in the Senate. And this is in an election year, or in a congressional term, when Democrats actually had a majority in the Senate. They just didn't have enough, they didn't have the 60 vote threshold to overcome a filibuster. And these weren't even votes that the Senate decided on, deliberated, and then voted down. These were all bills that never came up for a vote in the Senate because the Democrats couldn't overcome they couldn't overcome the Republican filibuster. So I think if there was more public knowledge and more public awareness of these things, then reforming these institutions could be combined into these broader efforts to protect democracy and these really robust movements that are already happening at the state and local level.
First, thank you very much for an absolutely outstanding and comprehensive presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I wonder if you could comment briefly on some of the trend lines going forward, in the sense that my understanding, for example, is that urbanization will be a feature of the American landscape as elsewhere in the world, which bodes well, I would imagine, for the Democrats. But on the other hand, if we look at college-educated white males in the United States, my understanding is that that number is declining, which presumably may very well favor the GOP. So I'd be interested in a couple of quick impressions that you have as to the landscape over the next decade or so. Thank you.
Yeah, so looking ahead, what does that mean for the demographic bases of the respective political parties? I mean, I guess that this relates also to the question that was asked at the beginning of the session. So I think a lot depends on whether young people continue to vote in large numbers and whether they continue to support Democrats as strongly as they do. And if both of those trends hold, then I do think you'll see a much stronger base of support for Democratic candidates. Then you had, so you mentioned increasing urbanization and increasing urban majorities. That is a good harbinger for Democrats. And what was the trend that you mentioned for Republicans?
My understanding is that white males that are college graduates, that number as a percentage is declining steadily.
Yes. So then that's another trend that is concerning, and not just for the electoral fortunes of Democrats, but for the role it'll play in increasing polarization, is increasing polarization along the lines of education. So that's now one of the strongest and the most pronounced cleavages, is increasingly Democrats are a party of college educated and postgraduate and increasingly people without a college degree are supporting Republicans, and not only white males without a college degree. So increasingly white women without a college degree, and even people of color without a college degree are increasingly moving in to the Republican Party. So I think that specifically is something that Democrats, need to not only be aware of, but to actively find a way to counter. And not only because there are fewer people that are obtaining a college degree, and so that the way the effect that will have on, again, their electoral fortunes moving forward, but more because if anything, this is just going to continue to amplify the trends that we've seen as parties have aligned along the lines of race and in ideology and in geography. And I guess I'll conclude these particular remarks by noting that that some Democrats have recently made some success in doing that. So I think candidates like Fetterman in Pennsylvania that appealed to white working class voters also made more inroads among the non-college educated than a lot of its Democratic counterparts have traditionally done. Glusenkamp Perez in Washington's 3rd District is another example where she managed to, again, make inroads and win more support from non-college educated voters. So I think with the appropriate candidate selection and the appropriate mobilization strategies, Democrats can potentially counteract the sorts of trends that you're referring to.
Thank you.
So there is room for optimism.
There's always room for optimism. I think, and actually I'll close on that, because I think for me, the greatest source of optimism is all of the great work that grassroots movements are doing on the ground. I mean, in an election year that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and all of the fundamentals suggested that Republicans would make huge gains in this election. And in some contexts they did. So like Florida and New York, Republicans had a pretty good night. But in places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin to some extent, depending on the race, Michigan, those Democrats had huge wins in those particular states, and that wasn't just by accident. That's because a lot of it was because there were groups on the ground that were actively mobilizing and getting Democrats to turn out to vote. They were amplifying some of the same concerns that we're here talking about today, with a particular focus in those particular states on the threat to democracy, because both Michigan and Pennsylvania had candidates running for governor that were rampant election deniers, and they had Republican state legislatures, so that was a big threat. And abortion rights were directly at stake. So you had a huge mobilization countering those efforts. And I think the reason Democrats did so well, way better than expected, in those states were really critical for the Democrats to not only hold their ground, but to make gains and to do well, was because of all the really hard work that people were doing on the ground in order to protect our democratic institutions and protect individual rights. So yeah, so if there's a source for hope, that's it.
As they say, all good things have to come to an end, and I just wanted to thank you on behalf of everyone here today for taking the time not just to speak here today about such an important subject to the United States, but also to Canada as well. But taking the time to get on an airplane, come all the way here, stay overnight, and I know you've got such a busy schedule at home teaching, and so I'd like to thank you for that as well. So if one more round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'll also just say, I did a couple of midterm talks on Zoom, and as chaotic as the traveling is, it's so much nicer and just more gratifying to do this in person and to be here and speak to you in person than to do it over a computer screen. So thank you for the invitation and for your great hospitality.
Thanks. And just before we all leave, because I'm sure you have other things to do, I'd like to, again, Becca, thank you. Thank you to Power Corporation of Canada for their support to our organization. Thank you for coming today. Our next event is here in the Union Club on the 8th of December. It's about the U.S., sorry, not the U.S., this is about the U.S. It's about the Soviet Union-Canada hockey series that took place in 1972. It's more than hockey, though. It's a look back at the geopolitics at the time, the challenges posed by the Soviet Union, the role that Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau played in breaking down doors and building a relationship with the Soviet Union, and the hockey match that occurred as well. So I'm hoping that if you haven't responded, you'll be able to join us here for that event on the 8th of December. Thank you for coming. See you at the next event. Thank you.